Elara Voss did none of these things. She uncrossed her legs and stood with deliberate slowness, the movement so measured and controlled that it somehow seemed louder than all the Crefly war chanting that had preceded it. She looked up at Zolan on his slowly rotating platform, and across the 50 meters of empty air that separated them, their eyes met, and she smiled. It was not the desperate smile of someone facing extinction. It was not the manic grin of someone whose mind had broken under pressure. It was a smile of a player who has just laid down the final card in a game her opponent didn't even know he was playing. Finally, she said, one word, spoken clearly, without fear or hesitation, and it cut through the silence of the chamber like a knife through silk. Then she turned her back on the High Arbiter, an act of such casual disrespect that it drew audible gasps from several delegations, and walked toward the massive doors of the Grand Chamber. Her boots struck the ancient stone floor in a steady rhythm that neither rushed nor slowed. The sound echoed in the sudden silence. Click, click, click. The footfalls of someone who knew exactly where she was going had no doubt she would get there. The doors, each weighing several tons and operated by mechanisms older than some civilizations in the chamber, opened for her. She passed through without looking back. They sealed behind her with a deep, resonating boom that vibrated in the bones of every delegate present. For a long moment, nobody moved. The silence stretched and deepened until it became almost physical, a pressure against the eardrums, a weight in the lungs. Grand Marshal Sevek of the Crefly, commander of the largest fleet in Council space, leaned forward in his seat. His compound eyes, capable of perceiving minute details across vast distances, studied the empty seat of condemned with unusual intensity. Sevek had commanded fleets for 43 years. He had fought in 7 wars and suppressed a dozen uprisings. He had seen courage and cowardice in every form they took, and for the first time in his long military career, he felt something cold and unwelcome settle in the pit of his stomach. In the Irani section of the gallery, Delegate Sarzha turned her aide and whispered in their species' primary harmonic frequency, carefully pitched below the range of the translation matrix. That was not the reaction of someone who had been condemned. Her aide, younger but no less perceptive, responded in kind. No, Delegate, that was a reaction of someone who had been unleashed. High Arbiter Zolan maintained his composure because he was far too experienced to let a single word from a human shake his confidence. But he noticed that the celebration in the chamber had died like a candle flame in vacuum, and no one seemed eager to rekindle it. The human is irrelevant, Zolan announced, his voice carrying across the chamber with absolute certainty. Our combined fleets number over 60,000 warships from dozens of species. Humanity has one system of note, a handful of colonial outposts, and a fleet our intelligence estimates at fewer than 800 vessels. This war will be concluded before their sun completes another rotation. The delegates nodded and murmured their agreement because the mathematics were overwhelming and the logic appeared sound. Surely no species that young, that small, that isolated could possibly stand against the full might of the Galactic Council. But in the intelligence section of the Council station, not everyone was celebrating. Trikesh was not celebrating. While his colleagues in the Irani Intelligence Division toasted their apparent victory with fermented beverages from a dozen worlds, he sat at his console pulling up everything the Council had on Commander Elara Voss. Her file was surprisingly thin. Name, Elara Voss. Species, human Homo sapiens. Current posting, Ambassador to the Galactic Council. Time and position, 30 years, 2 months, 17 days. Service photo, a woman with gray hair and unreadable eyes staring directly into the camera with an expression that revealed nothing. And then, page after page of redacted information, black bars obscuring text. Entire sections marked with classification codes that Trikesh's credentials, which were quite high, couldn't penetrate. Someone with very significant clearance had sealed away vast swathes of this woman's history. Trikesh had been an analyst for 16 years. He had reviewed thousands of files. Redactions were not uncommon. Every intelligence service protected its sources and methods. But this was different. The redactions weren't just extensive. They were systematic, as if someone had deliberately excised anything that might reveal who Elara Voss truly was. He dug deeper, using search protocols that technically exceeded his authorization, but that he had employed before when official channels proved insufficient. What he found made his blood run cold. The redaction codes weren't human codes. They were council codes, which meant that someone inside their own intelligence apparatus had been actively hiding information about this woman, not for months or even years, but for decades. Someone with access to the council's most secure systems had been deliberately ensuring that no one, not the council delegates, not the military commanders, not even the intelligence analysts, knew who Elara Voss really was. Trikesh reached for his communicator to alert his superiors, then stopped. If the redactions came from inside the council, then alerting his superiors might mean alerting the very people responsible for hiding the truth. And if they had gone to such lengths to conceal information, they wouldn't appreciate someone uncovering it. He put the communicator down and stared at the nearly empty file of the woman, who had just smiled at her own species' death sentence and walked out as if leaving a disappointing dinner party. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice, the same voice that had kept him alive through 16 years of analyzing threats to the council, told him that the galaxy had just made a terrible mistake. For the first time in his career, he desperately hoped that voice was wrong. Meanwhile, aboard a small, unmarked transport ship that had undocked from the council station exactly 90 seconds after Elara Voss had exited the Grand Chamber, the woman everyone thought they knew sat alone in the cockpit. The ship was unremarkable to the point of being deliberately forgettable, a standard civilian transport of a model used by thousands of independent traders throughout council space. Its transponder identified it as the Wandering Merchant, registered to a Plessy trading company that existed only in the labyrinthine depths of council bureaucracy. Elara guided the ship through the station's departure protocols with the ease of long practice. The traffic control officer who cleared her for departure would later recall nothing unusual about the flight, just another civilian vessel, leaving just another day. Certainly nothing connected to the historic declaration that had just taken place in the Grand Chamber. As the station fell away behind her and the stars beckoned ahead, Elara engaged the faster-than-light drive. Space twisted. Reality folded in on itself according to principles that still seemed like magic even after 4 centuries of human FTL travel, and the ship leaped forward into the cosmos. Alone in the cockpit, with the stars stretching into impossible lines of light around her, Elara Voss opened a secure communication channel using an encryption protocol that the Council had never detected in 3 centuries of signals intelligence. The encryption was based on mathematical principles that wouldn't be discovered by Council science for another 200 years. Principles that humanity had developed independently, in secret, with the specific purpose of ensuring their most important communications could never be intercepted. "Fenrir, this is Voss," she said, her voice steady and calm and carrying just the faintest edge of something that might have been relief. "The Council has declared war. Activate the doctrine." There was a brief pause, exactly 2.3 seconds, which was the time required for the signal to travel from her ship to Earth at faster-than-light speed, be processed, and return. Then a voice responded, deep and measured, belonging to a man who'd been waiting for this call for a very long time. "Understood, Commander. Welcome home." Elara closed the channel and leaned back in her seat. She looked out at the stars rushing past her window, each one a sun, each sun potentially home to worlds and civilizations and people living lives they believed mattered. For the first time in 30 years, she let the mask fall away from her face. She did not look triumphant. She looked tired, bone deep, so deep tired in a way that only someone who has carried an impossible weight for decades can be tired. But beneath the exhaustion, there was something else, a certainty, a readiness. She had spent 3 decades smiling at people who wanted her species dead. 3 decades cataloging every weakness, every fault line, every hidden shame of the most powerful empire the galaxy had ever known. 3 decades playing the role of the patient, irrelevant ambassador while building something in the darkness that would shake the foundations of civilization itself. Now the smiling was over. Now the real work could begin. The galaxy thought it had just sentenced humanity to death. It had no idea that humanity had been sharpening its teeth in the dark for 200 years, waiting for exactly this moment. And the woman they had dismissed as an irrelevant ambassador was the most dangerous human being alive. The wolves were coming home, and they were hungry. 7 kilometers beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean, buried in the crushing darkness of the Mariana Trench, where pressure would reduce an unprotected human body to pace in seconds, there existed a place that no galactic sensor had ever detected and no alien intelligence operative had ever suspected. Fenrir. It was the largest military installation humanity had ever constructed, and yet officially it did not exist. A sprawling underground fortress carved into the bedrock of the ocean floor over the course of 8 decades. It represented an investment of resources so massive that if its true costs were known, it would dwarf the GDP of most human nations. The facility was shielded by layers of technology so advanced that even the Council's deep-skin satellites, devices capable of detecting a concealed weapon from orbit, saw nothing but water and stone when they examined this patch of ocean. Stealth systems based on principles of quantum entanglement and probability manipulation created a bubble of normalized reality around the facility. To any sensor, no matter how sophisticated, Fenrir simply wasn't there. General Idris Mwangi stood at the center of the war room, a massive circular chamber lined with holographic displays, showing the positions of every known Council fleet in the galaxy. The displays updated in real time, fed by an intelligence network that spanned 300 worlds and employed over 15,000 operatives, most of whom had no idea who they were really working for. Mwangi was 63 years old, though he looked younger, a benefit of the cellular regeneration treatments that all Fenrir personnel received. He was a tall man with skin the color of polished mahogany and eyes that had seen things he would never speak of. He had been the commander of Fenrir for 18 years, which many had spent nearly a third of his life preparing for a war he had hoped would never come. Now the doors opened, and Commander Elara Voss walked in for the first time in 3 years. She looked different down here, beneath the weight of 7 kilometers of ocean. With the diplomatic mask she had worn for 30 years finally discarded, she appeared both harder and more human. The careful neutrality that had defined her public persona was gone, replaced by something sharper, more honest, infinitely more dangerous. "Welcome back, Commander," Mwangi said, extending his hand across the gap between them. Elara took it and held it for just a moment longer than protocol required. For 30 years she had been surrounded by aliens who wanted her species dead. The simple warmth of a human handshake meant more to her than she would ever admit aloud. "It's good to be home, General," she said, though her voice carried a weight that belied the simple words. "I wish the circumstances were different." "No, you don't," Mwangi replied with the ghost of a smile. "You've been waiting for this as long as I have." She didn't deny it. Within the hour, the Joint Human War Council assembled in Fenrir's central briefing theater. 47 senior officers from every branch of humanity's hidden military apparatus. People who had dedicated their entire lives to a war that most humans didn't even know was being prepared, took their seats in the amphitheater-style chamber. Mwangi stood before them and activated the main display. The hologram that filled the room was not a star map or a fleet diagram. It was a document, old and faded and stamped with classification markings, so severe that fewer than 200 people in all of human history had ever been allowed to read it. "For those of you who have not been briefed at the highest level," Mwangi began, his voice carrying easily through the chamber, "this is a Fenrir doctrine. It was authored 212 years ago by the first generation of human analysts who made contact with the Galactic Council. It is the reason every single one of you is sitting in this room today." He let that sink in before continuing. "When humanity first encountered the Council, our early diplomats were welcomed with open arms and grand speeches about unity and cooperation. But our intelligence analysts saw something different. The hologram shifted to show a timeline. Species after species after species, stretching back 10,000 years. Each entry showed first contact, initial negotiations, and then one of two outcomes: acceptance of the tied accords or extinction. Every species that joined the Council was required to surrender military sovereignty, Mwangi continued, to pay economic tribute calculated to keep them perpetually dependent, to accept cultural integration protocols that, over the course of a few generations, effectively erased their unique identity. They weren't allies. They were vassals, dressed in the vocabulary of partnership. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the holographic projectors. And every species that refused, Mwangi said, his voice dropping lower, was destroyed. Not conquered, not subjugated, destroyed, wiped from existence so completely that most current council species don't even know they ever lived. He looked at Elara, and she stepped forward to take over briefing. This part was hers. I have spent 30 years inside the council's intelligence infrastructure, she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen things she could never unsee. I have read their classified histories, documents sealed away in archives that officially don't exist. The Council has executed 17 separate wars of annihilation over the past 10,000 years. And in every single case, the targeted species was guilty of the same crime. She paused, making eye contact with each officer in turn. They were too independent, too creative, too unpredictable, too dangerous to control, and so they were eliminated before they could become a threat. She let that statement hang in the air like smoke. That is what they intend to do to us, she said simply. They were always going to declare this war. The only question was when, and we have spent 2 centuries making sure that when they did, we would be ready. Mwangi brought up the next display, and the room filled with ghostly blue outlines of warships, massive vessels that dwarfed anything the Council had ever built. These are the Raft-class dreadnoughts, he said, 12 kilometers long, armed with weapon systems that our research teams reverse-engineered from captured Council technology and then improved by 3 generations. We have 47 of them stationed in hidden shipyards across 18 dead systems. A murmur ran through the room. Even among this group of senior officers, most had never seen the full scope of what humanity had built in secret. In addition to the dreadnoughts, Mwangi continued, we have a fleet of over 9,000 vessels ranging from stealth frigates to carrier battle groups, all hidden in locations the Council doesn't know exist. Their intelligence estimates our fleet at fewer than 800 ships. We have spent a great deal of effort making sure they continue to believe that number. Elara took over again, her voice crisp and professional. But ships alone won't win this war. Over the past century, I have built an intelligence network that spans 86 Council species. We have operatives embedded in their military commands, their supply chains, their communications infrastructure, and their political leadership. She activated a display that showed a web of connections so vast and intricate that it looked like the neural map of a living brain. Millions of threads connecting thousands of nodes and patterns that seemed almost organic. We know where every Council fleet is stationed. We know their patrol routes, their fuel depot locations, their emergency fallback coordinates. We know which admirals are competent and which ones got their positions through political patronage. We know which vassal species are loyal and which ones are one bad order away from mutiny. She turned to face the room directly, her expression serious. The Council thinks they're going to war against a minor species with a small fleet and no allies. They have no idea what they're actually facing. And by the time they figure it out, it will be too late. General Mwangi stepped forward for the final part of the briefing. When he spoke, his voice took on a gravity that made every officer sit up straighter. But I want to make something absolutely clear, he said. We are not going to become what they are. We will fight this war with everything we have, but we will not commit genocide. We will not glass homeworlds. We will not slaughter civilians. He looked around the room with eyes that burned with conviction. The Council rules through fear and subjugation. We will win through strength and liberation. Every vassal species that surrenders will be freed, not conquered. Every world we take will be given back to its people. We are going to tear down the largest empire the galaxy has ever known, and we're going to do it without becoming monsters. The room was silent for a long moment, and then Elara spoke quietly. Some of them won't surrender. The Verith and the Crethali will fight to the last ship. They have too much to lose. Then we will defeat them, Mwangi replied, his voice decisive and certain. Thoroughly and completely. But we will give them every chance to stop before we do. Elara nodded. She had expected that answer. Despite everything she had seen, everything she had done in 30 years of espionage in the Council's darkest corners, she was glad that the man leading humanity into war was someone who still believed in mercy. Far above them, on the surface of the ocean, a world of 8 billion people went about their ordinary lives, completely unaware that beneath their feet, the machinery of liberation was waking up, and in hidden shipyards scattered across the dark spaces between stars, engines that had been cold for decades began to warm. Their war was coming. On the council station, Trikesh sat alone in his quarters, staring at Commander Elara Voss's empty file, and running calculations that he desperately hoped were wrong. The numbers didn't lie. They never did. Numbers were the one constant in a galaxy full of deception and political maneuvering. Numbers were truth, distilled to its purest form. And these numbers told a story that terrified him. The resource consumption data from human colonies, data his division had been collecting for decades as part of routine intelligence gathering, suggested an industrial output roughly 12 times higher than what a fleet of 800 ships would require. 12 times higher. Trikesh had run the calculations 3 times, checking his methodology, questioning his assumptions, searching for errors. But the mathematics were sound. The humans were producing enough raw materials and manufactured goods to support a fleet of approximately 10,000 vessels, not 800, which meant either the Council's fleet estimates were catastrophically wrong, or the humans were building something on a scale that defied every assumption the Council had made about their capabilities. He had tried to warn his superiors. 3 separate reports filed in the weeks before the invasion, each one noting the discrepancy, suggesting that the Council's intelligence on humanity was incomplete at best and dangerously inaccurate at worst. Every report had been ignored, or rather, acknowledged and filed away with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that was indistinguishable from deliberate suppression. Now, 60,000 warships were being assembled to invade a species that might have more than 10 times the military capacity the Council believed they possessed. Trikesh pulled up the human broadcast message that had been transmitted after the war declaration, a simple statement from the human government expressing regret that diplomatic solutions had failed and determination to defend their sovereignty. Standard rhetoric, the kind that every species issued when faced with war, except for one phrase that kept nagging at him. The statement had included the line, "We are prepared for any eventuality, not we will do our best or we will fight bravely." Prepared for any eventuality, as if they had already considered every possible outcome and had responses ready for each one. Trikesh closed his console and sat in the darkness of his quarters for a long time. When he finally spoke, it was a single whispered word that carried all the terror of someone who has just realized that his entire civilization has walked into a trap. Oh! 3 weeks after the Galactic Council declared war on humanity, the largest invasion fleet assembled in recorded galactic history entered the Acheron Corridor, a major shipping lane that served as a primary gateway to human-controlled space. Grand Marshal Sevik of the Krethali stood on the command bridge of his flagship, the Unbreakable Verdict, and watched 12,000 warships stretch across the void in a formation so vast it blotted out the stars behind it. He was not a fool. Unlike the politicians on the council who had celebrated the war declaration as a victory were already assured, Sevik had spent his entire career, 43 years of continuous military service, studying warfare in all its forms. He had read the histories of every major conflict in the past 2,000 years. He understood that overconfidence had destroyed more fleets than any weapon ever built. "What do our forward scouts report?" he asked his tactical officer, his mandibles clicking together in the careful rhythm that indicated deep thought. "The human colony on Acheron 7 appears to be deserted, Grand Marshal. No fleet presence, no orbital defenses, no civilian communications traffic." Sevik's mandibles slowed their rhythm, the Krethali equivalent of a frown. "Deserted?" he repeated, his voice flat. "Yes, sir. It appears the humans have evacuated their outer colonies entirely." The admirals of the other species, on the Joint Command Channel, responded with amusement. The Verith commander's harsh laughter cut through the comm system. The humans run like prey animals before the predator. The Orani fleet captain suggested they push straight through to Earth without stopping. "Why waste time securing empty colonies? Let us strike at the heart of their resistance." Sevik did not laugh. An evacuated colony meant one of 2 things. Either the humans had given up, which contradicted everything he knew about their species from 30 years of diplomatic contact, or they had cleared the area because they didn't want their own people in the way of whatever was coming next. "All ships reduce speed to half," Sevik ordered, his voice cutting through the celebratory chatter on the command channel. "Deploy sensor drones in a full sphere formation. I want comprehensive coverage. Scan everything within 10 light minutes of this corridor. Grand Marshal, his communications officer interjected carefully. The other fleet commanders are requesting we maintain invasion speed. They're concerned that... I don't care what they're concerned about, Sevik replied, his voice hardening. This is my operation, and we will proceed with appropriate caution. Execute the order. The sensor drones launched, thousands of them, spreading out across the corridor like seeds scattered in wind. They were sophisticated devices, each equipped with multi-spectrum sensors capable of detecting everything from heat signatures to quantum fluctuations. For 20 minutes, they reported nothing. Empty space. Background radiation. The cold silence of a region that appeared completely abandoned. Then one of the drones vanished. Not destroyed. There was no explosion, no debris field, no radiation spike that would indicate weapons fire. It simply ceased to exist, as if something had reached out and plucked it from reality. Then another vanished. Then 3 more. Sevik opened his mouth to give an order, but he never got the chance. Because in that moment, the darkness around his fleet came alive. Ships appeared out of nothing, not decloaking in the way Council stealth technology worked, where there was a telltale shimmer and a sensor ghost before the vessel became visible. These ships simply existed where a moment ago there had been empty vacuum, as if reality itself had decided to stop hiding them. They were human warships, and they were everywhere. The first volley hit the Council fleet before a single ship had raised its shields. The weapons the humans used were unlike anything the Council had encountered. Concentrated particle beams that cut through hull armor like it was tissue paper. Guided projectiles that moved so fast the point defense systems couldn't track them. Electronic warfare pulses that scrambled communications across the entire fleet in seconds. All ships raised shields and returned fire. Sevik roared, and to his credit, his crew responded with the discipline he had drilled into them over years of training. But training meant nothing against an enemy that had spent 2 centuries preparing for exactly this moment. The Battle of Acheron 7 unfolded like a nightmare given physical form. The human fleet was smaller, roughly 2,000 ships against 12,000. But they fought with a coordination and precision that made the Council forces look like amateurs stumbling through their first engagement. Their technology was so far beyond what Council intelligence had predicted that every tactical assumption, the invasion plan, was built on collapsed in the first 10 minutes. Council ships fired their weapons and watched in disbelief as human vessels simply moved out of the way, not dodging in the clumsy, predictable patterns that ships in combat usually followed, but flowing around incoming fire with fluid grace that suggested their engines operated on principles the Council had not yet discovered. The human ship struck with surgical accuracy, targeting engine systems and weapons arrays rather than trying to simply destroy vessels outright. It took Sevik several minutes to understand why. "They're hurting us," he said aloud, watching his tactical display with growing horror. "They're not trying to kill the fleet. They're trying to disable it and drive us into a tighter formation so we can't maneuver." He was right. Hidden weapons platforms activated across the corridor. Platforms that had been sitting dormant in the asteroid fields for years, waiting for this exact fleet to enter this exact space. They opened fire on the edges of the Council formation, pushing surviving ships inward toward the center of the kill zone. It was a masterwork of tactical planning, executed with the cold efficiency of a trap that had been prepared with infinite patience. For hours into the battle, Sevik made the hardest decision of his career. "All Krethli vessels execute emergency retreat," he ordered, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around him. "Fall back to the Acheron staging point." "Grand Marshal," his communications officer said, uncertainty clear in his voice, "the other fleet commanders have not authorized a retreat. The other fleet commanders are dead or will be within the hour." Sevik replied with cold clarity, "I will not sacrifice my fleet for their pride. Retreat, now." The Krethli ships pulled back in disciplined formation, and Sevik watched on his tactical display as the remaining Council forces continued to be systematically torn apart. And then the humans did something that changed the war forever. Every communications frequency in the corridor suddenly carried a human broadcast, not on encrypted military channels, but on open civilian frequencies that every ship in the fleet could receive. The message was simple, delivered in every Council language simultaneously with perfect pronunciation. Attention all vassal species serving in the Council invasion fleet. This is a united human command. You are not our enemy. Your masters declared this war, not you. Stand down your weapons and power down your engines, and you will not be harmed. We are offering you something the Council never has, a choice. For a long, breathless moment, nothing happened. Then a single Irani frigate powered down its weapons. Then a Dramari cruiser. Then 2 more Irani ships and a Plessis destroyer. Within minutes, 46 vassal warships had stopped fighting and were broadcasting surrender signals. Sevek watched from his retreating flagship as ships that had been part of his fleet minutes ago simply stopped obeying the Council, and he understood with terrible clarity that the humans had not just won a battle, they had fired the first shot in a revolution. The Battle of Acheron 7 lasted 11 hours from first contact to the final surrender signal. When it was over, the numbers told a story that would shake the foundations of the galaxy. The Council lost 4,200 ships, destroyed, disabled, or surrendered. Humanity lost 340 vessels. Post-battle analysis would later reveal that most of those were unmanned drone frigates that had been deliberately sacrificed to draw fire away from crewed ships. In the intelligence section of the retreating Krethali fleet, Trikesh sat at his console and stared at the battle data with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. He had tried to warn them. 3 separate reports about the discrepancy in human industrial output. 3 warnings that the Council's intelligence was catastrophically wrong. All ignored. Now 4,000 ships were gone, 46 vassal crews had defected, and the war was 3 weeks old, and the Council was already losing. Trikesh pulled up the human broadcast message and read it again. We are offering you something the Council never has, a choice. He felt something crack open inside his chest. Something had been keeping sealed for his entire adult life. He had always known that the Council was not what it claimed to be. He had read the classified histories, the records of annihilated species, the details of how vassal populations were kept in line through economic dependency and cultural suppression. But he had told himself that the system worked, that stability was worth the price, that someone had to maintain order in the galaxy. Now he watched 46 ships choose freedom over obedience, and he wondered if he had been lying to himself all along. 7 kilometers beneath the Pacific Ocean, Elara Voss watched the battle data scroll across the screens in Fenrir's command center. She allowed herself one slow breath of something that was not quite relief and not quite satisfaction. Phase 1 is complete, she said to General Mwangi, who stood beside her studying the same displays. Casualties, he asked. 340 of ours, mostly drones. 4,200 of theirs. 46 vassal defections. Mwangi nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. And the vassal crews who surrendered? They're being treated well, Elara confirmed. Medical ships are already on site. Food, medical care, and a clear message that they are guests, not prisoners. Mwangi placed his hand on a display table and looked at the star map showing humanity's territory, still tiny compared to vast expanse of Council space, but no longer dark and quiet. It begins, he said. No, General, Elara replied, her voice carrying the weariness of a woman who had been fighting this war in silence for 30 years before the first shot was ever fired. It began a long time ago. This is just the part where they finally notice. 2 months into the war, the Galactic Council was falling apart, not because humanity was destroying it from the outside, but because humanity was doing something far more dangerous, giving people a reason to tear it down from within. The human advance through Council space followed a pattern that no one in the galaxy had ever seen before, because it broke every rule of conquest that had governed galactic warfare for 10,000 years. When human warships entered the system, they struck hard and fast, disabling military installations and orbital defense platforms with the same terrifying precision they had demonstrated at Acheron 7. Within hours, the system's ability to fight back would be completely neutralized. And then the warships would leave, not to a staging area, not to an occupation orbit. They would simply leave. In their place, convoys of unarmed vessels would arrive, ships carrying food, medicine, engineers, and communication equipment. The crews of these ships broadcast a single message to the bewildered inhabitants of the systems they had just conquered. You are free. Govern yourselves. We are here to help if you want us, and we will leave if you don't. The first time this happened, the Council's propaganda ministry declared it a trick, an elaborate deception designed to lull vassal species into false security before the humans inevitably revealed their true intentions and began subjugation. But the subjugation never came. On the liberated world of Draymar Prime, homeworld of the Dramari, a species the Council had forcibly pacified 6 centuries ago, human medical teams set up field hospitals and treated wounds that Council healthcare had ignored for generations. Human engineers helped repair infrastructure that the Council had deliberately left crumbling, because a species dependent on its masters for basic utilities was a species that would never rebel. Human teachers shared knowledge freely. Not the carefully curated curriculum the Council approved, but actual, complete information about engineering, medicine, agriculture, and governance. Within a week, the Dramari Provisional Government sent a message to every other vassal species on Council communication channels. The message was 4 words long. The humans told truth. That message did more damage to the Council than 1,000 warships ever could. On the Vareth homeworld, High Arbiter Zolon sat in his private chamber and watched intelligence reports pile up like a rising tide, each one worse than the last. The Orani communes had fractured. Half their fleet had recalled to their home system and declared neutrality. The other half had mutinied against their Council-appointed commanders and was now actively cooperating with human forces in the liberation of the Plessis systems. The Telvari Confederacy had withdrawn from the war entirely after human operatives leaked evidence that the Council had been secretly taxing Telvari colonies at 3 times the agreed rate and funneling the excess to Vareth military projects. The Krethli were still fighting. Grand Marshal Sevik had reorganized his forces and was conducting a disciplined defensive campaign. But even had begun pulling his fleets back to protect Krethli territory rather than defending Council interests. How? Zolon whispered to the empty room. And for the first time in his long life, he didn't have an answer to his own question. His intelligence chief, a gaunt Vareth named Counselor Dravik, stood before him with a data pad full of intercepted communications. The human intelligence network is far more extensive than we ever imagined, High Arbiter. Commander Voss spent 30 years building an espionage apparatus whose full scope we're only now beginning to understand. Then root it out, Zolon snapped. We're trying, Dravik replied carefully. But we have a problem. Voss isn't just using her own operatives. She's leaking information selectively through our own channels, and we can't tell which leaks are real intelligence and which are fabrications designed to turn us against each other. He paused, then delivered the worst news. She sent classified documents to the Orani High Command showing that we plan to annex their resource worlds after the human war concluded. Those documents were authentic, High Arbiter. They came from your personal strategic archive. Zolon's eyes went wide. She accessed my archives? For the first time, there was genuine fear in his voice. We believe she has had access for at least a decade, Dravik admitted quietly. Possibly longer. The realization hit Zolon, like a physical blow. For 30 years, the woman who had sat quietly in the lowest seat of his grand chamber had been reading his most secret thoughts, plans, and strategies, and she had been smiling at him the entire time, and he had dismissed her as an irrelevant representative of an irrelevant species. Fool! Elara Voss had been counting on exactly that. Deep in Fenrir, Elara sat alone in her office, surrounded by screens showing the state of the war. She was winning so thoroughly and so completely that it almost frightened her. Almost. She had spent 3 decades building this machine of psychological warfare, and now she watched it operate with the terrible efficiency she had designed it for. Every lie she fed to the Council fractured another alliance. Every truth she revealed turned another vassal species against its masters. General Mwangi appeared in her doorway. "We need to talk," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made Elara look up from her screens. What happened? Admiral Chen's battle group liberated the Solari system yesterday. After the liberation, 3 of his captains refused to withdraw. Elara's expression hardened. They want to stay and occupy. It wasn't a question. They argue that withdrawing leaves the system vulnerable to Council counterattack. And they're not entirely wrong. But that's not what concerns me. Mwangi sat down across from her. What concerns me is the language they're using. They're calling it protection, but what they mean is control. And if we start controlling liberated systems, we become exactly what we're fighting against. I'll handle it, Elara said. No, Mwangi replied firmly. I will handle it. This is a command issue, not an intelligence issue. I need you focused on something else. He activated a holographic display, and a massive schematic filled the room. A weapon, ancient and terrible, shaped like a spear the size of a moon. Our operatives inside the Vera command structure have detected movement on a project called the Axiom device. It's a planet-killing weapon the Council has kept hidden for over 4,000 years, a relic from one of their early extermination campaigns. Elara stared at the schematic and felt something cold settle in her chest. They're going to use it on Earth, she said. Our intelligence suggests Zolon has authorized its activation. The weapon is hidden somewhere in the Vela system, likely in the accretion disk of a neutron star near the Council capital. Elara stood and walked to the display, studying the weapon with the same analytical calm she brought to everything. But Mwangi had known her long enough to see the tension in her shoulders, the tightness around her eyes. How long do we have? She asked. Weeks, maybe less. Then we move up the timeline for the final phase. We can't wait for the Council to collapse on its own. We need to go to Vela Prime. Mwangi nodded slowly. I've already given the order. The fleet is assembling. Far away, on an Irani intelligence vessel that was now operating independently of Council command, Trikesh sat in his quarters and stared at a decoded transmission he had intercepted from the Verith command network, the Axiom device. He had read about it in classified histories. A weapon so terrible that even the Council had been ashamed to acknowledge its existence. A weapon that could crack a planet's core and reduce an entire world to rubble in a matter of hours. And now Zolon was going to use it against Earth, against a planet of 8 billion people who had never asked for this war. Trikesh thought about the Dramari message. The humans told truth. He thought about the 46 vassal ships that had surrendered at Acheron 7 and been treated with kindness instead of cruelty. He thought about the liberated worlds where human doctors were healing people his own government had abandoned. He made his decision. He opened a communication channel, using a frequency that Elara Voss had embedded in a seemingly routine diplomatic broadcast months ago, a frequency that Trikesh had recognized for what was a moment he first detected it. A hidden invitation. A door left open for anyone brave enough to walk through it. This is Analyst Trikesh of the Irani Intelligence Division, he transmitted, his hand steady even though his heart was pounding. I have the location of the Axiom device, and I'm willing to share it. I ask only one thing in return. The response came faster than he expected, and it was Elara's voice, calm, warm, and somehow unsurprised, as if she had been expecting him specifically. Name it, she said. When this is over, Trikesh replied, remember that not all of us chose to be your enemy. There was a pause, and when Elara spoke again, her voice was softer than he had ever heard a human voice be. We already know that, Trikesh. That's why we're fighting this war. The largest fleet ever assembled in the history of the galaxy dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Vela system. For a brief moment, the neutron star at its center seemed to dim, as if even the universe itself was holding its breath. 14,000 warships hung in formation against the black. Not just human vessels anymore, but ships from 27 species that had once been vassals of the Galactic Council. Among them flew the battered but defiant cruisers of the Irani rebels and the ancient, hidden fleet of the Dramari that had been waiting in secret for 600 years for exactly this kind of moment. General Idris Mwangi stood on the bridge of the human flagship, the UHCS Prometheus, and looked out at the combined fleet through the viewport with an expression that was equal parts pride and sorrow. He knew what this day would cost. Status report, he said. All fleet elements in position, General. Council defensive fleet is forming up around Vela Prime. Approximately 8,000 vessels, primarily Verith and Crethily. Mwangi nodded. 8,000 was formidable, but the Council fleet was a shadow of what had been 4 months ago. The ships that remained were crewed by soldiers who had watched their allies defect and their empire crumble, who knew in their hearts that they were fighting for something that was already dead. Open a channel to the Council fleet, Mwangi ordered. All frequencies. The communications officer nodded, and Mwangi spoke clearly into the silence. "This is General Idris Mwangi of the United Human Command, addressing all vessels defending Valeth Prime. You have fought bravely, and you have served your duty. But the council you're defending has lied to you, used you, and is at this moment preparing to deploy a weapon of planetary annihilation against a world of 8 billion civilians." He let that settle. "We are not here to destroy you. We are here to end a system that has enslaved this galaxy for 10,000 years. Power down your weapons, and you will be treated with dignity. Continue fighting, and we will respond with overwhelming force. The choice is yours, and it is the last choice the Council will ever take from you." For a long, breathless moment, the Council fleet held formation. Then, one by one, ships began powering down. First, the remaining Irani vessels. Their crews had been waiting for permission to stop fighting, and Mwangi's words gave them that permission. Then the Plisi escorts and the Telvari support ships. Within 20 minutes, nearly 3,000 Council vessels had surrendered, leaving the Vareth and Krethli to stand alone. Grand Marshal Sevik, still commanding from the bridge of the unbreakable verdict, watched his allied fleet evaporate around him and felt something he had never felt in decades of warfare. Not fear, but a deep, exhausted resignation. He opened a private channel to Mwangi. "General," he said, his voice heavy, "I am a soldier. I don't agree with what the Council has done. I don't believe in the axiom device. But I swore an oath to defend my people, and I will not break it." "I understand, Grand Marshal," Mwangi replied, and he meant it. "Fight if you must. But know that when this is over, your people will be treated with the same respect as any other." "I believe you," Sevik said quietly. "That's what makes you so dangerous." The channel closed. The Battle of Valeth Prime began. The Krethli fought exactly as Sevik had promised, with discipline, honor, and a ferocity that cost the Allied fleet dearly. For 3 brutal hours, the space around the neutron star burned with weapons fire so intense that radiation alarms on every ship screamed without pause. But the numbers were overwhelming. The technology gap was real. Slowly, inevitably, the Krethli line began to buckle. While the fleets tore into each other above Valeth Prime, a small unmarked shuttle slipped through the chaos like a needle through fabric. It flew so close to the neutron star's accretion disk that its hull temperature climbed to levels that would have killed the crew of any Council vessel. Elara Voss sat in the pilot's seat and flew the shuttle herself, because she didn't trust anyone else to make the precise adjustments needed to navigate the superheated gas and radiation without being detected. Behind her sat a team of 12 special operators, the best humanity had. Soldiers who had volunteered for a mission with a survival probability that Elara hadn't bothered to calculate, because the number wouldn't have changed anyone's mind. Trikesh's intelligence had been precise. The axiom device was hidden inside a shielded station buried in the densest part of the accretion disk, a location so hostile that the Council had assumed no one would ever be able to reach it. They hadn't accounted for human stubbornness. The shuttle docked with a grinding impact that rattled every bone in Elara's body, and the team moved through the station's corridors with swift, lethal efficiency, neutralizing the small Vera security force that guarded the weapon. Elara reached the control room first and stopped in the doorway. High Arbiter Zolan was standing at the activation console, his 6 hands moving across the controls. The massive holographic display behind him showed the Axiom device's targeting system locked on a small blue planet orbiting a yellow star. "Earth, you're too late, human," Zolan said without turning around, his voice calm with the serenity of a fanatic who believed absolutely in the righteousness of his cause. "In 90 seconds, your world will cease to exist, and the galaxy will remember this moment as the day the natural order was restored." Elara raised her weapon but didn't fire. "Not yet. Turn around," she said. Zolan turned, and for the first time in 30 years, the two of them faced each other without pretense. No diplomatic masks. No political theater. Just a man who wanted to destroy a world, and a woman who had spent her entire adult life making sure he never could. "You're an anomaly," Zolan said, genuine bewilderment in his 4 ancient eyes. "Your species is barely 4 centuries old. You shouldn't have been able to do any of this. You shouldn't exist the way you exist." "And yet here I am," Elara replied. "Here you are," he agreed, "standing in the way of 10,000 years of order and stability. Do you understand what you're destroying? The Council brought peace to this galaxy. The Council brought obedience, Elara said. And you called it peace because no one was left who was allowed to disagree. Zolan's hands moved toward the final activation sequence. Elara crossed the room in 3 steps and put a round through the console. The targeting display flickered and died. The Axiom device's charging sequence collapsed in a cascade of failing systems. Zolan stared at the destroyed console, then at the woman who had destroyed it. For the first time in his life, the High Arbiter of the Galactic Council had nothing to say. Elara looked him in the eye. She didn't gloat. She didn't threaten. She simply spoke the truth. You had 10,000 years to build something worth preserving. You built a cage. We've been free for 400 years, and we built something worth fighting for. That's the difference. Zolan was taken into custody without further resistance. When news reached the Council fleet that the High Arbiter had been captured and the Axiom device neutralized, resistance collapsed. Grand Marshal Sevek ordered his remaining ships to stand down, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement that the war was over and that continuing fight would serve nothing but pride. The guns fell silent over Valeth Prime. 6 months later, the galaxy looked like a different place. The Galactic Council was formally dissolved in a ceremony attended by representatives of over 300 species, many of whom had never been allowed to speak freely in the Grand Chamber before that day. In its place, a new Galactic Compact was established, a voluntary alliance built not on tribute and submission, but on mutual cooperation and shared defense. Its founding charter was authored by a committee that included humans, Orani, Dremari, Krethli, and a dozen other species who had decided that the future was worth building together. Trikesh served as the Orani representative on the charter committee. On the day the document was signed, he stood at the podium and told the assembled delegates that 6 months ago he had been an intelligence analyst serving an empire he knew was unjust, and that a single human broadcast offering a choice had changed the course of his life and the course of his civilization. Grand Marshal Sevek retired from military service. When a human journalist asked him what he thought of the species that had defeated him, he clicked his mandibles in what the translator rendered as a dry laugh. "I think they are the most terrifying and the most merciful enemy I have ever faced," he said, "and I am grateful that they chose to be the latter." General Mwangi accepted a position as the Compact's first joint military commander. His first act was to order the decommissioning of the Axiom device. It was dismantled piece by piece, its components scattered across the accretion disk of Valeth's neutron star, where they would burn for eternity. Elara Voss was offered a seat on the Compact's governing council. She declined without hesitation. On the day of the signing ceremony, she was found sitting alone on a balcony overlooking the new capital, watching ships from 100 different species fly in formation across the sky for the first time in galactic history. Not as a show of force, but as a celebration of something no one had dared believe was possible. A young reporter approached her and asked what she felt. Elara watched the ships for a long moment. The reporter noticed that the woman who had terrified the most powerful empire in the galaxy looked smaller than expected and tired, and human in a way that no intelligence file or battlefield report could ever capture. "Relief," she said quietly. "Just relief." The reporter asked if she had anything else to add. Elara shook her head and turned back to the sky. The sunlight caught the scar on her face and the silver in her hair, and she looked like what she was, a woman who had carried the survival of her entire species on her shoulders for 30 years and had finally been allowed to set it down. Somewhere far below, in the streets of the new capital, a Dremari child and a human child were playing together, chasing each other through a crowd of dozens of species who walked freely for the first time in millennia. Neither child understood the significance of what they were doing, because to them it wasn't historic. It was simply normal, and that, more than any battle or treaty or speech, was a victory that mattered. The wolves had come home, and they had brought the dawn with them. The Grand Chamber of the Galactic Council was a monument to imperial hubris, the largest enclosed structure ever conceived by sentient minds in the known galaxy. Its vaulted ceilings stretched so high that atmospheric processors maintained distinct weather patterns at different elevations. Today, every one of its 42,000 seats was occupied. Representatives from 342 civilizations had journeyed across the stars, some traveling for months through the twisted geometries of faster-than-light space, all to bear witness to what they believed would be the defining moment of their age. High Arbiter Zolan of the Verith hegemony occupied the chamber's central dais, a massive platform that rotated with glacial precision on invisible suspensor fields. His position ensured that every delegate, regardless of where they sat in the circular gallery, would at some point face the full weight of his regard. He was an imposing figure even by Verith standards. Nearly 3 meters tall, his chitinous exoskeleton gleaming beneath ceremonial robes that had been worn by High Arbiters for 6,000 years. His 4 compound eyes, each capable of perceiving wavelengths of light invisible to most species, burned with the cold satisfaction of a chess master watching his opponent realize, too late, that checkmate was inevitable. Zolan had spent 37 years engineering this moment. 37 years of careful political maneuvering, of alliances forged and debts called in, of promises made and threats whispered in the shadows of diplomatic functions. Every speech, every vote, every seemingly casual conversation had been a thread in the web he had woven, and now that web was complete. "The vote is final," he declared, his resonant voice cutting to the chamber's anticipatory murmur. The translation matrix embedded in the chamber's architecture seized his words and replicated them simultaneously in every known language, a cacophony of meaning that somehow resolved into perfect clarity for each listener. 318 delegates in favor, 24 opposed. The Galactic Council has officially declared a war of total annihilation against the species known as Homo sapiens of the Sol system. The response was immediate and visceral. The Crethali delegates, insectoid warriors whose civilization had been bred for conquest over millennia, clacked their massive mandibles together in a war rhythm that had once struck terror into 100 worlds. The percussive sound reverberated through the chamber with such force that the atmospheric processors struggled to compensate, creating brief eddies of turbulence that swirled through the upper galleries. The Orani, a species of ethereal beings who communicated as much through harmonic resonance as through words, hummed their ancient battle hymns. Their voices wove together in perfect polyphonic unity, creating harmony so complex that some of the younger species delegates felt tears spring unbend to their eyes, though they couldn't have said whether from beauty or from dread. The Dramari, by contrast, sat in absolute silence. They had learned long ago, through 6 centuries of brutal subjugation, that in chambers such as these, silence was safer than celebration. Their stillness was its own kind of testimony. Zolan raised one of his 6 articulated arms, and the chamber fell quiet with the abruptness of a blade severing a thread. When the High Arbiter demanded silence, the galaxy obeyed. It was one of the fundamental laws of the universe, as reliable as gravity. For too long, he continued, his voice carrying the weight of righteous conviction, this young and reckless species has defied the natural order of the cosmos. They have refused to sign the Tide Accords, the very foundation of galactic civilization. They have expanded their colonies beyond their sanctioned borders, claiming systems that by ancient right should fall under council jurisdiction. And they have shown nothing but contempt for the traditions and authority of this august body. He paused, allowing his words to settle into the minds of his audience like sediment drifting to the ocean floor. Then he looked down toward the lowest tier of the gallery, where a single figure sat alone in an ancient seat carved from a single piece of black stone. It was called the Seat of the Condemned, and in 6,000 years of council history, no one who sat there had ever left that chamber with their civilization intact. "We gave them every opportunity to submit," Zolan said, his voice heavy with the sorrow of someone who genuinely believed in his own righteousness. "We offered them the protection of the Accords. We promised them a place of honor within the Council. We asked only that they accept the wisdom of civilizations far older than their own. They chose defiance, and defiance has consequences. Every sensor, every optical organ, every consciousness in that vast chamber turned as one toward the human ambassador. Commander Elara Voss sat in the seat of the condemned with the posture of someone attending a mildly interesting lecture. One leg was crossed over the other, her hands resting calmly in her lap, her expression as serene as still water. She looked exactly as she had for the past 30 years of her service on this station, composed, patient, utterly unreadable. She was tall for a human, nearly 2 meters in height. With short silver hair, she kept in a precise military cut. A long scar ran from her left temple to her jaw, cutting through her face like a river through landscape. In 30 years, Despite countless inquiries from curious diplomats of dozen species, she had never once explained how she had acquired that mark. The chamber waited. Diplomatic tradition, refined over millennia, was clear on this point. The condemned species was expected to make a final statement, typically a plea for mercy, or at minimum, an attempt to negotiate terms of surrender. In 6,000 years of recorded council history, every single species that had occupied that chair had followed this script. Some had wept. Some had raged against the inevitable. Some had offered everything they possessed, their technology, their resources, their very autonomy, in exchange for survival.